Morning, everyone. My name is Dustin Gass. I'm the lending team lead for the South here for AFSC. Great to be here this morning. Great to see so many faces in a room again and be able to participate today. I'm from the Strathmore branch office. So this year, AFSC, as I said, mentioned, is a proud sponsor for the Farming Smarter Conference and Trade Show. Over the years, always appreciated these events, sharing knowledge, research, development, to the connection with producers and brainstorming of ideas. So of course, in our industry, in ag, sharing knowledge is crucial. And we know the future of ag is transitioning to the hands of the next generation. So while we've seen plenty of farm kids heading into careers outside of ag, there's still many who want to continue farming. And so we all have an opportunity to support them in building a strong foundation for the future success of agriculture. So, we talk about cross-generational, there's differences in culture, ideas, life experience, and that can sometimes make communication and collaboration difficult between generations. So today, many organizations are sitting at an interesting crossroads, where the workforce is likely to have staff from different generations, baby boomers, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. And that's interesting, Gen Z is already well into the workforce, with 1997 being the arbitrary date. So many are in their early 20s already. And of course, millennials like myself already have the creaky knees and the back pain. So, the future is, into the next generation. So with that, we've seen, of course, huge advances in technology and changes within agriculture. So as the industry changes and develops, AFSC is here to support the next generation build their future. And of course, we all know how expensive farming and ranching can be to get into. And so, of course, we have our next generation loan program to help support young producers and new entrants within agriculture, so they have the financial support they need to get started. So cross-generational collaboration, it can be challenging, when you have, of course, family and different ideas. However, investing in and really preparing the future workforce, is to take the lead is really important and worth it. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Butler, who is our keynote speaker this morning. Jeff is an author, researcher, TEDx speaker, and practitioner with his company, Trinity Fix. He's also a workforce strategist with a wealth of experience studying human behavior in the workforce. Of course, he has experience in many different industries and organizations, including John Deere, helping companies, find ways to thrive and grow stronger with a multi-generational workforce. And Jeff also tells me he did do work with DeWalt Tools. So that, John Deere and DeWalt Tools has a little more sway than Amazon in this room today. So he definitely understands the challenges of cross-generational collaboration and communication. So I'm looking forward to listening to Jeff share his thoughts and insights and strategies with us. So with that, please help me welcome Jeff Butler. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Can you guys hear me in the back okay? Yes? All right, well, good morning. Fantastic. Well, this is the first time I've been in Canada since the pandemic, so it's very exciting to be here. Now, if you looked at my background a little bit or what you heard, a lot of it revolves around how to work with different individuals. And for this talk, I'm not going to necessarily speak on the specificities, technical side of agriculture, but more about how to actually work with people. Now, the reason for that is I grew up in a family that had, two family businesses. One was in construction, another in technology. So for the construction side, as many of you younger individuals know, that means right after school, having to work on the site on there. And for me, that meant even on weekends. So one weekend, 7 a.m. rolls around. I'm still asleep. Dad goes on the door, knocks on. Hey, get up. You got to cut some parcel wood real quick. So I throw in my pants, my shirt, right? 5 minutes later, I'm out the door. I'm all natural, no coffee, and I go up to the parcel wood. Now, traditionally, when it comes to cutting with a skill saw, Hand goes here, skill saw goes here, you go like this, right? Because you aim, you look, right? That's traditionally the universal format. Agreed? Okay, so that morning I wanted to be creative, and I decided, what if I put both hands on the same side? So I held the parcel wood here, the skill saw here, and whoop, there I ended up in the hospital. And I got to pay for my first hospital bill, and I looked at my mom when I got the hospital bill. I'm like, oh my gosh, just for stitches in the ER? She's like, yes. And I said, well, why aren't you paying for it? She's like, who cut your hand? I'm like, touche. And that's exactly why I won't be going into the technical side of agriculture, but rather more of the human side of it. How do you actually connect and work with different individuals who are in, say, a working family environment, or maybe not family, but just multi-generational environment? Now, with each presentation, I always like to get to know the audience. So for the Generation Xers in the room right now, 1961 to 1981, go ahead and raise your hand if you're born between that age range. Okay, a few of you right here, keep your hands raised if the following apply to you. If all three apply to you, keep your hands raised. Are you skeptical about authority, tend to see the glass half empty, or go at it all alone? If all three apply to you, keep your hands raised on there. Okay, we got 2 so far. Okay, perfect. I'm on a roll already. Okay, baby boomers, 1946 and 1964. Raise your hand. The baby boomers in the room on here. All right, keep your hands raised if all 3 apply to you. Are you a rule follower, never heard of TikTok, and are loyal and self-sacrificing? We got like 1.5 over here. All right, 2.5. I'll give it on that. Very sensitive. Okay. So millennials, born between 1980 to 2001. I know there's a few millennials in here. All right, perfect. Keep your hands raised. Same drill if all 3 apply to you on here. Are you entitled, lazy, and love technology? So I can only do that because I'm a millennial in this respect on now. Here's the thing. So to get into this line of work, it's very odd on there. It's not like you wake up one day and say, oh, I want to talk about, workforce and generations. I used to give a lot of talks on technology, and one day someone pulled me in the back of the room and said, hey, you look like you're 12 years old. You should speak on generations. So I went online. I started Googling and looking at all the large media outlets. And when I read, I didn't really believe. And I said, well, I don't believe baby boomers do that or generation does that. So what I did is I took the most common stereotypes and I put them in the presentation, and I asked people, does this apply to you? And very often it doesn't, which is why the vast majority of information that's out there with generations tends to lead people astray. And so, for instance, I want to set the record straight on that. Now, the biggest area where you'll see this is in the area of Generation Y versus Millennials on there. If you look online, you'll see a lot of articles about Millennials and Generation Z, usually used interchangeably on there. The weird thing is they come from 2 entirely different places. One's from Harvard Business Review, and the other one's from 2 authors who wrote about generations on there. In fact, Generation X in the book from Neil Howe and Louis Strauss was actually called 13ers. So what people basically do is they coin a certain number of years, whatever the media takes on in terms of the generational year. They become the go-to expert. They get all the media appearances and consulting engagements. Sort of works like that. So a lot of the information tends to be more polarized towards the direction of people they appear vastly more different than people actually are experiencing. Now here's a good example of that. Most people, when they hear about new things like Facebook now becoming Meta and the virtual reality world on there, many people think, oh, well, the younger generation, they probably then don't like being in person. They don't really want to, interact with people because now we have all these devices, smartphones. Why would actually people want to communicate if they have all those wonderful things? Well, in the environment that Hubble did research on, they wanted to figure out who liked remote work the most and the least. And guess out of all the generation, who wanted to be in the office working in person out of all the generations? Millennials. Turns out even younger than that, Generation Z. They wanted to be in the workplace and they did not like remote work. Now my hypothesis for that is, well, maybe they don't have family, kids, the dog at home and all of that. That's basically their main social outlet on there. So a lot of that information tends to be not what we may think it is on there. So what I want to do is actually give sort of a framework of how that actually works in that generational environment. Now with different generations, there's sort of the catch-22 of leadership, I call it. For instance, you have one side which is people who are more seasoned, I like to call it, who've been there for a while, they know how to run the environment on there. And they are successful because of all the decisions they made in the past to that point. So if you go up to them and say, well, try this different, it's like, why should I? For 20, 30, 40, 50 years of doing this, I've been successful. This is why I'm here. The weird thing about that is they're operating under the axiom that the world is still the same as it was 50 years ago. So at one point, the more seasoned side needs to be open to new ideas, which is why all of you are here, right? To learn different ideas, which is good. You're not a part of that group. That's a different group. Who's not in this room right now? So that's the more seasoned side. The other side of the spectrum is of people who are just joining the working world. And the big thing here is you don't know what you don't know on there. You may go to the university, get straight A's, but that might not necessarily be what the working world is really all about. How many of you have actually gone kayaking before? Kayakers? Okay, so most of you will then understand the craziness of the story. So I have never gone kayaking, but the first time was 6 months ago. And I thought it would be a great date opportunity to take my girlfriend out into the ocean to go kayaking on there. And I thought, what a wonderful thing. You know, it's a physical activity. We'll be all outdoors during the pandemic, right? It gets really, you get all like cabin fever. So we go and they have kayaks at the apartment that we were at. So we both, not her, dragged them out. And they were really heavy. Like I, compete in weightlifting. I'm like, these are 300 pounds. Of course, they're full of water. And I said, oh, that's unusual. Not a big deal. So I dragged the kayaks out into the water. Now, here's my logic. I said, you know what? It's probably not a big deal that half of them are filled up with water because plastic floats, right? So it will float on water. No matter how much water gets in the kayak, it will float. So we both go out into the water on there, us side by side in each our individual one-person kayak. And she's trying to paddle. And she's like, I'm not going anywhere. And I'm next to her, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm kind of going somewhere on there. And she's like, we should go out to the island, okay? We're in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, if any of you have ever been on water, everything that looks close is like 3 times the distance. So that 1 mile island was like 3 miles away. So me not knowing any better, I'm like, oh, I'll show her how much of a man I am. I'm going to go out and kayak to the island. So I kayak, and I can't see her anymore. And when I finally get there and I'm coming back, and of course, the waves are now like 4 feet. Turns out enough water gets in the kayak, it flips. I'm out in the middle of the ocean, no one's there, right? And I'm like, all right, well, my kayak's flipped, let me flip it over. Can't flip it back, too much water. So I'm pushing the kayak back to the side of the beach that we were at, and this guy comes by. And he asked me, hey, do you need help? And I responded in a way I still don't understand to this day. I don't understand why I said this, but I literally said this exact thing. I said, hey, no, I'm just exercising. I can't make this up. Like, I literally said that, and he looks at me like I'm crazy. And he's like, he drives away, comes back, and he says, no, I'm going to tow you. So he tows me on his little jet ski that he has. I jump on back. I have to put my arms around this stranger who I never even met before on there. And he tows me back, and of course, when we get back to the water, girlfriend's still in the same spot, still paddling, looking at me, and I'm like, yep, there we go. So here's the thing. I talk about this stuff, and I think I know some things, but I still run the things I don't know what I'm supposed to do on there, and that's the exact example is I don't know what to experience. I thought plastic floats, it kind of does, but not really when it comes to kayaks and oceans on there. So you do need experience to know when you're first entering the working environment on there. So those are the catch-22 of leadership that has to take place when working with different generations on there. So in my presentations, I like to have quizzes to make sure everyone's following along okay. It's either true or false. I'll say 1, 2, 3. You yell out true or false. If everyone says it at the same time, no one knows you're wrong. Sound good? Okay. Generation Y and millennials are interchangeable. 1, 2, 3. All across the board, we got false on that side. All right. Technology only impacts us on a sociological level. 1, 2, 3. False. Also neurologically too. They showed research that came out recently that actually took place in Canada that looked at attention span. In the year 2010, people were tested for attention span. They clocked in at like 12 seconds for an exercise. Well, a decade later, they clocked in again at 8 seconds. For fun, they also tested a goldfish that clocked in at 9 seconds, a second better than humans. So if you want to go online and type in your attention span is less than a goldfish, go ahead and you'll see how technology is playing an impact there. And last but not least, millennials are not able to buy houses because they spend too much on avocado toast. 1, 2, 3. All right, all across the board on there. It's true according to Washington Post on there. Now, here's the thing. When I first read that, I don't like avocado toast. I think it's too weird. It's just naked. There should be like turkey or something, cheese. It's just weird for me. Some people like it. So I looked into it. It turns out it comes from Australia. In Australia, there was a 60 Minutes interview with a millionaire, and they were asked, hey, why are you so successful? And he said, well, I don't have to spend $4 on cups of coffee and $14 on avocado toast. Now that went on to Twitter. On Twitter, that goes viral, and overnight, millennials and avocado toast are one. Now, it still could be true, right? So Huffington Post surveyed every single generation, and they found out that a certain generation likes avocado toast more than the others. And which generation is that? Generation X, not even millennials. So if you were offended by this, don't worry, it's not even true on there. All right, so crossing the generational bridge, there's several different pieces to it. The first one is the alignment portion of it. Now, when you have different groups of individuals, regardless of their background, their age, the easy thing to really work with those amazing amount of permutations it could be is understanding what expectations are. Now, expectations are defined very differently on there. For this, it's basically there's an implicit agreement between two different or a group of people on there. And this is not only for the working environment, but also your family environment, wherever you go in the world on there. And if you start seeing things through this lens, it becomes astronomically easier to see why different individuals don't get along effectively on there. For instance, even in this room, there's a series of things that we've agreed upon that if that breaks, the environment will be sort of broken in there. It's sort of like why you shake someone's hand, why you wear a mask. There's a series of expectations of every single environment. Now, why is that so important when dealing with different generations? Well, in different environments, there tends to be different expectations wherever you go. For instance, imagine that you post up an outside sales interview, right? And maybe their job is to go to different farms or different businesses and sell their particular product, but they have to travel, okay? Be in person. Now, you get different resumes that people submit online, and one person, maybe Baby Boomer Bob, says, hey, what's the base salary? Maybe then you get someone from Generation X, Jill, that's like, well, is there any growth opportunity in this? Maybe because I want to lead a team, and I have a mortgage and kids, and I want to be able to handle all of that. And of course, you might get someone else who's like, hey, can I work from home? Right? You get a variety of responses in a similar environment. Now, the reason why that's an issue is because there's something called Adam's equity theory. Whatever environment you're in, you try to maintain a sense of balance and fairness. You can think of it in this way. Imagine you're shoveling snow for 10 hours and you're paid $10. Your friend comes along and they also shovel snow for the same amount of time, but they're paid $20, twice the amount that you are for the same amount of time. What's your response? Well, some people respond differently. They might decrease their output, they might push more authority, or maybe they go into survival mode because, hey, I don't think this is fair, I'm just going to completely disengage, or they become passive aggressive. I was in Georgia, about a couple thousand miles south of here, and one individual right next to his boss said, I will hit him over the head with a shovel on there. Next to his boss, that incredible. So there's a variety of responses in order to maintain that sense of fairness. Now you may think, well, my family business or wherever I am, that doesn't apply. Well, researchers wanted to see how deep does this really exist within living organisms on there. So they went into nature and they wanted to see, does Adam's equity theory happen in other places as well? So they put two monkeys side by side and they fed one grapes, another cucumber. Now for those of you who don't watch Joe Rogan and don't know a lot about monkeys, the monkeys like grapes way more than cucumbers on there. So this is what took place when examining what the monkeys do.
Get a grape and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. and she gets a grape. And the other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again a cucumber. She tests her rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
So Adam's equity theory, yes or no? 100% right there. So it exists everywhere within the working world and even in nature. So the question then is, okay, what specific areas tend to have this, let's say, misalignment of expectations the most? You have it in things like work-life balance, when people show up, when people leave, how many hours that they put into work on there. Work ethic, how hard someone works for the amount of time that they're putting in. Or maybe how to plan for the next generation of who takes over what. And how to communicate in certain circumstances with people. I'm sure many of you have had the instance where someone texts you instead of calling on there, right? How do you handle those different things? Well, to put that last one to rest, there was research done in the 1960s that looked at what really made someone likable and able to build rapport with someone else. And they took 3 different factors into the case. They took in the content, so it took a transcription of what they said. Then they looked at body language, and last but not least, the tonality, the changes in their voices on there. And out of those 3 variables, it turns out that content, what was actually said, was only 7% of the overall rapport building. Then came tonality at 38%, and the rest was body language. That is why when you're watching TV, and you may see someone who's not a very good actor, and you're like, they're not on point, because the words don't match their body language and their tonality on there. Because we watch a lot more for that than the actual words that someone says on there. So the way this ties back to work is, if you have something very heavy to say, maybe it's a performance review, letting someone go, or maybe there's a massive changes taking place in your business, meet people in person, or if you can't do in person, maybe someone's sick with COVID, do a video call. Because even in a video call, you can get body language, and you can also get tonality. But please don't text them or email them. You can go really, get mixed results on that. So handling difficult coworkers. This is another really big thing. Now, maybe someone expects higher pay for the level of contribution on there. Maybe they're putting in a certain amount of hours, they want 2 or 3 times the pay. Or maybe they believe that the rules don't necessarily apply to them, right? They can cut corners, and this isn't necessarily one generation. This happens across all different ones. Maybe someone who's more senior who says, hey, I've been here for so long, I can do whatever I want. Or someone brand new is like, well, I don't feel like the rules apply to me because I got, let's say, a 4.0 in college. Or people showing up late. Now, here's the thing. With difficult employees and situations, each one of these falls back on a misalignment and different expectations. That individual believes that for X amount of contribution gets Y amount of results. But the employer, or maybe the direct report manager, or what have you, believes it's something else. There's a mismatch on there. And if that mismatch is too different, they can't work together. Every working environment has to have one or the other, otherwise they just can't meet at all on there. Another major area for this is family work ethic on here. Let's say you have one individual who might be expecting a child on the way, and they want to put in a lot more hours in order to afford and take care of this new child who's going to be there. Well, how do you handle if one child works 3 times as much as another and there not be a breakdown in terms of the Adam's equity theory as mentioned earlier? Well, a really good option for this is having a family ledger. Basically, tracking every single hour that someone puts in. Because the common thread here is the similar way that things are tracked. That's what brings things into fairness on there. Unfortunately, my family ledger one day was on a whiteboard, and someone was cleaning the house and just wiped out the whole whiteboard. So that whole summer of tractor work I did was suddenly gone on there. And so point being is, the consistency is very, very important on there. And that could help when people are working at different levels of rates on there. Another thing is family financial planning. again, if someone wants to increase, decrease the amount of their spending, it's good to know what that's supposed to be in the future long run. Because in agriculture, there's of course a cycle on there where you have different purchases at different times of the year, so you have to know what the cash flow is like. So if someone's going to work a lot more or wants to withdraw a lot more money from, say, the family bank account on there, it's good to have that resource at play to know, hey, Sally's going to want to do X at this time of the year, so there's some extra money for that particular purpose on there. So that's with family work ethic on there. Now the big elephant in the room when it comes to family businesses, or businesses at all, is who takes over in one generation to the other. Now there's some complications on that, because I currently have a company where one sister at one point managed another sister. And friction can happen when one manages the other when they're the same generation level, not necessarily different generations. So how do you resolve the situation if one generation is leaving and another has to fill in? Well, you have two options here. The first is that you hire someone from the outside that everyone agrees upon, like, yep, hey, we all agree that Sal, Bill, whatever their name is, can be a great supervisor or leader. So you have democratic buy-in for that person. That way, it's not necessarily like, well, this is the favorite child out of the bunch on there, right? You're able to avoid that whole friction point when dealing with different generations. Now, the second option is, what if you cannot afford or you don't necessarily trust, right? You don't trust anyone else to come in for the family business. Well, if you're going to go down that route, there's a couple things I recommend here. One is that before you make that decision, you get very clear, whoever's in line for that role, and say, look, this is what's going to happen in the future. I'm no longer going to be here. This role's going to open up. Here are my expectations for this particular role. Anyone up for this? If there's 7 people in the running for it, say, okay, this is how I'm going to measure to see who's going to be the runner-up for this. And then the next point, which is very clear, is making it transparent to everyone. So maybe they have to show up at certain days of the year, or maybe put a certain level of productivity on there. But if everyone can see, there's no hidden, oh, well, you just scam someone else out of it, right? It's very clear, everyone's on the same page. And then from there, measurements are as clear as day. And then you don't necessarily have to make a decision, it's already lined up in front of you. Now this happens in a lot of different places. I don't include this in this presentation specifically, but you can also use this for, let's say, if someone needs to be let go in some way. Maybe they're not performing very well and their performance is dropping on there. A really good way of going about it is when you meet with them and saying, hey, see things aren't going very well, here's my expectations of the role, I'll give you for this month, and we'll go in week by week and measure it. By the end of that month, what's really interesting when you make things clear, they'll actually just leave. Because they would say, hey, Ryan's on the wall, I'm not meeting it, I see that expectation's there, and we'll just step right out. So then a lot of that difficult conversation or surprises, there's no surprise. Because a lot of that has been taken care of ahead of time, so it alleviates a lot of the friction that happens with management. Especially when people say, hey, I got blindsided, I didn't see this coming. That should never be an issue if you're able to address this well ahead of time on there. So when it comes down to expectations, a few things to ask yourself are, A, what are the expectations that make this actual work successful, right? Once you have that in place, then you can start mapping out, okay, for people who are just coming into this workplace, where do they stand? And the third one is, out of the ones that make us successful, which ones are malleable? Which ones can change on there? Because there are certain things that you have to keep it just the way they are on there. And that's the reason why you're successful. Because with every new person that comes into a team, group, company, organization, family, either the family has to change to the person, or the person has to change to the family, or mixed in between. There has to be some sort of bridging involved in that process on there. So being very clear about that can help you say, well, is this worth giving up, or do we have to stick to this? All right, next please. Family ledgers are used to improve work ethic differences. 1, 2, 3. Absolutely true. All right, so a little better on this one. Handling succession planning involves a democratic process. 1, 2, 3. False and true all across the board on there. Let's say if you handle someone from the outside, right, that could be a democratic process. Or if it's option 2, it could be false, where it's basically whoever does the best in that process on there. Last but not least, third question here is, if someone in a family business wants to buy a Lamborghini, it should be included into the financial planning. 1, 2, 3. It's true, it should actually be including the financial planning, because if someone wants to go that far, you better prepare for that in the future. Not that that's going to happen, though. All right, so the second part is once you get very clear about the alignment portion, people are on the same page. Next one is building the relationships and strengthening those, whether they're blood-related or non-blood in that side. Now, what's interesting is that the biggest thing that tends to happen is that generational differences of the expectations, which we just covered. However, when it comes down to family on there, very often when you have people who might not necessarily be blood-related, you have to break that professional facade. But for family businesses, they already have that on there because they've already had that ability to have that relationship outside the working environment. So they understand each other, so retention is naturally much higher in that case. So there's a natural strength to that. But what if there's a difference when you keep in other people or maybe just different generations on there? How can you help them put aside their differences to get something done effectively? Well, there's a great author called Christopher Booker, and he wrote this book that took him about 20 years to write called The 7 Basic Plots. And what he did is he went through all different kinds of literature and tried to look at what are the common story types, archetypes in there. And the reason why he was doing that is because regardless of what language you speak, people can understand stories on there. And you want to understand how do different cultures understand and articulate ideas, because if you understand that, you can communicate across no matter how different someone is to another person. Now, out of those 7 basic plots, the one worth mentioning here is actually the quest on there. And the quest is basically when a group of individuals has to put aside their differences, come together, and solve some sort of problem that is impending on there. Now, the very awesome thing about being in a family-type business or a tighter-knit group on there is naturally the process is that you have the family unit, and it's the protection of the family unit against everything else outside of the world on there. But when you bring other people on there, it's what is the quest in front of us? And very often in our culture, it's the change of seasons on there, right? Other businesses, there's always some sort of challenge that's presented. Now, the reason why this is worth mentioning is that there is a lot of research done into businesses and how people put aside their differences. Jim Collins, a Stanford professor, but also the author of Good to Great, you might have read it before, written about what are the most successful teams, organizations do that others are not on there. And the things that cultures are able to put aside their differences, first off, there's a big, hairy, audacious goal. That's what they called it, where there was some target really far out to reach. But the cool thing about that, when you have a family business, is that that's already kind of built in because you have the protection of the family on there, which is a natural, let's say, archetype role for people to follow on there. And the other side of it is a definitive us and them. And that's what really strengthens a culture, a family, because there's an inside and there's an outside on there. For instance, here's a few examples in Alberta. Here's one, Future Fields, where they are basically growing meat in labs at a lower cost. Now, here's the thing. Some of you might say, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing that. Some of you might say, wow, that's great. That's going to be so much more environmentally friendly on there. It's going to divide people one way or the other. But the point is, that's the point. There's an us and there's a them on there. There's two individual groups. And when you have a division, it tends to solidify that culture and ingrain those stronger connections across the board on there. So that's one example. Another is the Maple Leaf Green World that's in Calgary, Alberta. And there's two things here worth mentioning. One, maybe you're for marijuana and not so for marijuana on there, but either side, that can divide people. But another is they recently did a joint venture with Beijing, China on there. Some people have opinions about that, one way and the other. But here's the point. People who join that company, there's a definitive us and them. Some people really for it, some people as not on there. So that's what really strengthens that culture and the relationships within that unit in there. So usually it takes some sort of outer force to solidify those relationships. Now, the elephant in the room, or let's say the mask in the room, is why didn't COVID-19 unite us all? If that's true, and there's some sort of external force, why didn't we all come together during COVID-19 on there? And that really troubled me for a while, because I thought when COVID first happened, I thought, well, first off, my business is going to go to crap, because I, make a lot of my living in person, so all of a sudden my work became illegal for the first time. But I was hoping that people would be able to put aside their differences to get things done. I thought like politically people would become more aligned, but it did exactly the opposite. And the reason for that is, one of the biggest events that affected both US and Canada, and I actually had to look into this, was when 9/11 happened, there was something called Operation Yellow Ribbon, where Canadians were also sent overseas as well. And when 9/11 happened, there was a definitive us and them. So it was very clear who was on our side, who was the enemy on there. So it was very easy where those relationships were built. The other side was, now, COVID could be anyone. It could be a family member, it could be the person across the table from you, and it divides people in an infinite amount of ways, spreading people further and further apart. And of course, thanks to technology, you can find just about any opinion online and solidify your position on there. And so with that infinite amount of opinions, that divided people further and further and further from one another on there. So now we ended up being completely divided when something such as a pandemic should have really brought us together. Should have, but did not on there. But that's how something like an external force like the pandemic really divided people from each other on there. So when you look at different things you can take from this, one is, when you look at your team, family member, etc., what is the unifying cause? What is really keeping you guys together? What is that sort of goal that you guys have in front of you that will bring everyone to that front? What are the cultural insiders and outsiders that you have? What really means that you're in the family, outside the family, in the business, out of the business on there? And do you have dividing causes? And what I mean by this specifically is that very often right now, especially in the States, we're struggling with this a lot, where a lot of the politics join the working environment. Now, there's two ways of handling that. There's one, which is, let's say you have a larger team. Usually companies under 50 people don't have to worry about this too much, so I would assume there's only a few of you in the room that might relate to on this, but let's say there's some sort of protest, cause, movement, right? As a leader, you can either ignore it, and then someone in the company will say, well, why aren't you supporting this? Well, maybe you hold off on it, but then you have maybe external pressure outside the company of, oh, you're not in support of this because you don't say this. Okay, so you have that external pressure. But let's say you take a stand and say, I support this. Well, that can divide your company right in half, because maybe half of your company's for it, half of your company's against it on there, right? So that's sort of the catch-22 that people have now when there's something political. Do you basically support it, for or against it publicly, or do you not say anything about it? Either way, there's a difficult decision to make on there. But I thought I would include that because the more I'm looking at the world of organizational psychology in business and companies, that's becoming more and more common these days. It wasn't as much before, but now it's becoming a lot more heated on where's your stance on this type of movement. All right, next quiz. Family businesses have a stronger culture than traditional corporate ones. 1, 2, 3. True, absolutely true on that side. Insiders and outsiders in a culture tend to weaken cultural strength. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I can't hear you. 1, 2, 3. All right, good. We'll do one more on that. And Adams' equity theory focuses solely on demographic inclusion. 1, 2, 3. False. That is correct. Fairness. All right, so now we're at the last part of the bridge. We've aligned people. We started to build that culture. Now it's communication. Now with communication, many people talk about, the generations and conflict and all of that, but here's the thing. Generational differences can be a unique advantage because different viewpoints can solve problems more effectively if there's more variance in the amount of approaches to it. So the question then is, how do you communicate effectively in there between different generations? Because if you do, you can get those ideas into people who can execute on them, and that can further help the business that you're currently in on there. Well, the biggest part of that, of course, is the listening piece. And if you look at some of the most intimidating leaders that were in the world on there, I put Jack Welch near the top on there, and the reason why I put him there is he was known as Jack Nukem. So he would go into power plants and fire total power plants, and every year he had this rule that the bottom 10% of his workforce would be fired no matter what. No matter what was going on in your life, he would fire you if you're on the bottom 10%, no matter how well the company was doing. Because the problem was Japan was kicking General Electric's butt all around, so Jack Welch was brought in to turn it around. Now, with someone who's that sort of authoritarian and aggressive in their approach, also did something that might surprise a lot of you. He made it mandatory for every single one of his leaders to have a brand new college, just out of college person mentor them. Mandatory. So you're like a 23-year-old managing or in a mentor relationship with a 50-year-old, and that 23-year-old's telling the 50-year-old person what's going on. Why would he do that? Because he knew that generational gap existed, that with different changes in technology, he had to know what was happening in the world of today. So he made it mandatory so that those information, I like to call them innovation pipelines, existed because that communication was happening at the highest leadership level. So the point being is, yes, even individuals like Jack Welch and Andrew Grove, who also ran Intel, were very intimidating leaders, but really appreciated that knowledge transfer because that is what helps individuals, companies thrive on there when there's that communication taking place. Now, when you have this generational leadership and you're trying to solve a problem effectively, there's usually two different realms you can fall under. One is the democratic process. Everyone votes and there's a decision made. And the other is more of authoritarian, which is one person calls all the shots. You want to be somewhere in the middle. In my family, I grew up where my dad basically called all the shots. Mom put together the plan. The rest of the employees operate from there. That was typically how things were done on there. But the problem was we might not have the best plan in place because only one person was calling the shots on there. Now, the democratic process, if everyone always voted on everything, things slow down a lot. Like, you ever seen how the government runs? Very democratic on there, but things are a lot slower. But there's a lot of buy-in across the board. Yet, on the authoritarian side, execution's much faster on there. So you need some way to kind of balance between the authoritarian and democratic side when making the decisions in a group on there. Now, once you're able to start adding these effectively, people are communicating, getting buy-in, and being able to offer ideas, things start to happen. One is that there's less Thanksgiving fights. If you're in a family business, you will know across the board that it's a great way to have Thanksgiving fights is first happens out in the working environment. In fact, a lot of my dinners were basically my parents talking about business and not as much about family stuff related on there. So that could definitely take things over. Good news too is that there's better solutions to old problems, right? And then you have things such as higher buy-in from everyone and increased transparency of what's actually happening in the company. The buy-in is really important because that increases engagement. Now, occasionally, people will make mistakes. People will not do things the right way. So the question then is, okay, how do I then both receive feedback but give it? Now, typically, things have been done as, baby boomers, when they were doing work on there, traditionally in the organizational psychology world, they only need feedback maybe once in a blue moon. Generation X might be once in a while, and then Millennials, it's typically said, once every second on there. So obviously you see a big difference. So which is the best way to give feedback to individuals? Well, Leadership IQ looked at individuals who were given no feedback in the workplace, and they were much less likely to refer someone else to where they worked. That's one of the biggest indicators of whether some place is worth working for. So how much feedback do you really give someone? Well, in order to answer this effectively, I couldn't look at the workplace. I had to look at families and how the most successful relationships took place on there. And that led me to the perfect formula of how to start a fight every single time. You want to hear the formula of how to start a fight with anyone in a family? You want to hear it? Okay, I'll give you my formula of how to start a fight with anyone. Okay, so in every family there's usually some sort of joint responsibility, right? So let's say dishes. That's a really easy one, right? So your job is to load it and their job is to unload it, okay? So a week goes by, and they one day forget to unload it, okay? Here's the key, step one. Don't tell them. Step two, remember. Okay, time goes on. 1 day, 2 day, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Now step three in the process is just randomly forget one day to load the dishwasher. When they ask you, why didn't you load the dishwasher? You can turn around to them and say, well, 3 weeks ago, you didn't unload it, so why do I have to load it today? 100% of the time, you will get a great fight. Amazing fight on here. And that is exactly what managers do. Someone will make a mistake. They won't tell them for a day, 2 days, a week, 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden, they make a mistake and they say, well, You didn't do that, so why should I do this? Complete feedback breakdown. So what happens is that usually the most successful family relationships, but also working relationships, is when feedback's immediate. Someone makes a mistake, boom, let them know. In order to get here, my person who does my travel put on the wrong hotel. So after I came down 2 hours from the airport, from Calgary, I showed up at the wrong hotel, and it turned out they put the right hotel name, the location was wrong, and the description was the right hotel name. So the location was the only thing that was wrong. And I said, hey, let them know immediately right when it happened. You put the wrong location. Just make sure you do the full thing, right there. Because I know later on, if I mention that 2 weeks later, there's going to be a great fight. You got to let people know immediately when they make mistakes on there. And if you don't, it will become exponentially more difficult to address it later on. Now, when you give people feedback, typically what people do is something called the feedback sandwich. You might have heard of it before, right? It's like how you would think a sandwich would normally be. There's a positive side, which is the bread, a criticism, and another positive side. So positive, criticism, positive, okay? I'm not really big into that on here, and here's the reason. Let's take a pretty interesting example here. I like your hat. Your face is ugly, but your top is nice. If you ever say that to anyone, especially a woman on there, she will never forgive you for saying that her face is ugly. But that is how a lot of people give feedback. We're actually very much wired for that negative side on there. So how do you articulate good, positive intentions, but also have to give people criticism? Very simple. Split the two. Someone makes a mistake, hey, you got to adjust the planner, make sure you put the right location of the hotel. When someone makes a mistake or does something great, you just say, hey, you did a great job when you put together that profit and loss statement on there. I just want to let you know that. Did I do anything wrong? No, I just want to let you know that. Will they be able to take that in? Of course. And that will probably stay with them very long, that you just pull them aside and said, hey, I noticed you did something good. Because very often managers like to go, well, they messed up, so let's find something positive they did and throw it all together and hope they didn't hear it all negative. Got to split the two. That's going to help you out a lot in the long run. Now, another way of looking at this is direct versus Socratic feedback. When someone makes a mistake, you can say, hey, you should not hold your parcel board the same way as you hold the skill saw or you'll cut your hand, right? That's like direct feedback. The Socratic is basically asking, well, why would you do that? What is your reasoning behind that? Because every single action starts with a thought process on there. Now, direct is just asking the question, but Socratic's more asking, just answering the question. Socratic's more asking the questions on there. The reason why you go with more Socratic on there is because you all ideally want to teach someone what's the right thing to do. And if you can help their thought process and being able to realign it, that's more of a long-term solution on there. And if this might help you remember it, but one of the things that Socrates did that he's known for is that someone wanted to know how to accomplish a lot in their lives. So Socrates took them to the water and basically put them under the water and tried to drown them. And then the guy came up looking for hair, and he's like, as bad as your desire to breathe is how bad it needs to do to accomplish something. So very unorthodox way of drowning your students on there, but I think it was a very effective way to make yourself memorable in history, because I'm now talking about it thousands of years later. All right, last but not least is constant check-ins. Making sure you're checking in with people, because replacement anticipation is really important. If you know someone's not really feeling it, hey, you can put up job ads, being able to put the necessary resources to put essentially a backfill plan in place. And the most important thing here is usually when people first have their ideas of changing the workplace or some sort of idea that can make a massive impact, they say it usually in a one-on-one discussion. Like, hey, what do you think about doing this differently in the crops? That's where it starts. And that's where those big ideas come from that can rapidly change the entire way you do business on there, but it doesn't usually start publicly unless they're extremely extroverted. Next, from meeting with people, they feel heard and their engagement goes up because, of course, their ideas are being heard, they're being engaged on there, and that's where that tie-in starts to come into play. All right, last and final quiz of the day. Feedback sandwiches do a good job at splitting the negative and positive feedback. 1, 2, 3. Good, okay, I've been really worried if you guys did not get that ugly face thing. All right, direct feedback reveals the process problem to the employee. 1, 2, 3. True and false. So directed feedback is necessary when there's a building burning, right? You don't want to say, well, why do you think the building's burning, right? You just say, just leave the building, right? There's a time and a place for direct feedback, but not all the time. So those are the 3 pieces. When you work with different generations, there's the alignment portion. Then you essentially build that stronger culture in there, and then there's a communication portion. And if you're able to get that communication portion, that's what makes the generational divide become an advantage, because now you're getting everyone's intellect to solve particular problems, and that's where you start getting those breakthroughs and really start to thrive as a group on there. The last thought I'd like to leave you guys with is that throughout history, a lot of people like to capture the past in order to learn more about it in order to build a better future on there. And Inspiring Purpose was a nonprofit organization would basically have younger generations talk to older ones, and they would create collages and pictures of the big moments in history of what was captured on there. And one of my favorite pictures was this one from Christmas Day 1914. Now, this is a pretty well-known picture in history, and I was in Connecticut, and I was talking in front of a group, and there was a son, his mother, and a grandmother. The son said to me, this is true, he says, oh, those are the Native Americans. I said, no, those aren't Native Americans on there. This is World War I. UK, Germans fighting on there. Christmas Eve, for some weird reason, they're in trench warfare, okay? Dug down, 6 feet down, barbed wire, all they can see is they've been shooting across for days on end. All of a sudden, both sides Christmas Eve started singing Christmas carols. No one knows why. They left their guns in the trenches. They got back up out of the trenches, and if that's not weird enough, someone had a soccer ball. And they played soccer on Christmas Day. They played soccer, even though it was Great Britain and Germany, who were shooting each other days before on end, killing hundreds on each side. They got back into the trenches the day after and continued killing each other day after, and millions died in that war. But for that brief second in history, they were able to put aside their differences and realize that they didn't just belong to countries, they were both people at the end of the day who had families and wanted to enjoy themselves on this planet. And that's why these moments of history are so important that generations communicate, because those memories can be lost, and who would want to relearn that lesson on there? So very often we say we must know the past in order to repeat it in the future, but working with generations, we must know each other in order to build a better future. And that is the core of building an effective, multi-generational workplace. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I think we're just about coffee time, but do you have a minute to answer questions if anybody has questions from the audience? Are there any questions that you would like to ask about multi-generational and working together and some of the challenges? You've all got all those processes figured out in your mind? I knew John would be good for a question. Go ahead, John. What's your question?
You make me a bit uncomfortable when you talked about that you need us and them. It seems to me that that's a short-term way of building a business. You're not building towards a goal, but if you use it to separate people, it's kind of the political zone today.
Right.
I'd just like you to fill that in a bit more.
Sure. So what's often talked about from more of the organizational psychology side of being sort of political on that aspect is the side of, correct me if I'm wrong, but inclusion, correct? Now, the thing with inclusion that doesn't necessarily sit well with me is that let's say we have a completely inclusive company, right? That everyone's thoughts, ideas, beliefs are respected. Someone comes in that we hire, we don't know this initially, but they hate people with yellow hats. And our company has a yellow hat thing, so everyone's wearing yellow hats. They're throwing things at people, they're yelling, they're out of control, and we say, sorry, you can't be a part of us, so you can no longer be a part of the team. So we fire them. But aren't we an inclusive company, though, that we accept everyone of all different beliefs? That's where it gets tricky, because that's this sort of hallmark argument for inclusiveness, but it's actually still exclusive to a degree, because if someone breaks that cultural norm that we have, they'll be broken in there. So that's actually held in some way. So the argument underneath that too is basically saying, hey, you're gonna run your team the way you're gonna run it, and if it works for you guys, it works for you guys. But I don't think you should have it like X particular way. Does that help answer your question about the us and them concept? Yes? You're nodding your head, I don't know. I mean, you're chewing.
Pondering, he's
Yeah, it's interesting on there, because I think it's complicated from the standpoint that inclusive basically means that everyone's welcome on there, so there's no us and them. But if someone breaks that, of your willingness to hear from everyone's perspective, you would then realize, well, there actually is an us. There is a collective group of values that we have. And if someone doesn't share those values, that's a part of an external group on there. That is one of the reasons why you have large companies that would do these kind of crazy, almost cult-like things in there of like team exercises and songs and things that are pretty out there, because they're trying to instantiate stronger values on there that represent more of their particular set on there. But if they're always like, everything's fine and peachy, it's like, well, you can't run a company that way because everyone's doing something different. So there's always that line of whatever you agree upon in that company.
I got another question at the back. Go ahead.
Yeah. How, in family business, there's obviously more financial disclosure than the people who are working for a family business. Mm-hmm. But how do you suggest in a family business to make the family business more of a business and the family more of a family?
Yes.
You know, to me, that's a big challenge and creates a lot of conflict, especially when you get the factorial relationships of spouses and 3 generations and things like that.
That's a very difficult one on there, because that's something I'm struggling with right now, because I run my own business, but I don't know if I want, like, you know, my future wife or people to be involved, because I do want that separation, that balance. But it's also, will you bring in someone who you know will, you know, potentially be with you to the end of life on there? Because that's a very strong trusting bond on there. I would fall back on how to have that family, like, work-life balance on there, setting down some ground rules on there, like things like at dinner, like, hey, we don't talk about business at dinner time. Like figuring out definitive lines where you can say, work's here, family's there. And people would naturally try and bring that in. Like my mom and I are very similar type personalities. Middle of anything, she just starts talking business with me, right? So it meddles that work-life balance on there. So I would first draw that line of where is it appropriate and where it's not. The other factor you're gonna run into is expectations. And I've seen this in a lot of family businesses where, let's say, before the business was started, one brother owed the other. The brother who starts the business brings the one who owes the other, but that brother might not work very hard because he's like, well, my brother brought me in, I'm a part of the family, I can do whatever I want, right? That's a very difficult thing where if the brother, who he's had the, I don't want to say the name specifically because you can actually Google them, he kept his brother in the business for 10 years, but his brother isn't really doing anything. So that's why if you're ever going to go into that route, I would first identify, hey, here are the ground rules of this working relationship, but we have to communicate a lot during this path because I understand your values might change and you might want to go elsewhere. But I understand that our values might change and then the business might be better in a different direction on there. But if you set that straight up right when they join and you keep constant communication over that, people will be better aligned on there. Because that's the hard thing. When someone falls behind in family who's not working very well, but they're blood. So how do you address that? Hence the less Thanksgiving fights on there, that particular slide.
The other unfortunate piece is when you get spouses and multi-generational spouses, unfortunately, there will inevitably be a relationship breakdown.
Yes.
And how do you keep that from, and I was in one of these situations that fortunately ended well, but we had prenups with our partners.
Yes.
And everybody's like, well, that's a recipe for disaster. And I'm like, you know, that's out of respect for my business partner, because if things go sideways between my partner, I cannot have their family livelihood in jeopardy.
Right. And it is very difficult on that side when you get that involved, because it has that catch-22 on there, or the pros and cons. Very strong trust level, but what if they don't actually meet that side? And yeah, the prenub on there. I'm not going to say for or against prenub on there. I don't know enough about it on there because I haven't had to go into that, but let's just say I wish my parents did that. Based off of where things are in their family businesses.
So yeah. Just another question. You mentioned about the individual, you know, a month monitoring and also that personal stuff. Do you find that is becoming a more or less effective tool given different labor laws that we have in Canada as compared to the US?
I cannot speak to your labor laws, because if I had them in front of you, I could give you more of an accurate way of saying that. But at the end of the day, the person who's running the business on the managerial side will probably be doing things maybe not to code on the labor laws, but it's more of that actual understanding of what that person's agreement is with that direct report on there, right? Because people like to say, well, there's unions involved and there's this and that, but at the end of the day, there's two people. It's human-to-human relationship on there. In order to have that human relationship, they need to understand what the other person's expectations are of them and how are they in that expectation range. If you don't talk about that and you say, well, it's a labor law, you're going to, right? So it comes back to more the communication piece on there. But yeah, I wish I could answer more methodically about the labor laws, as I don't have them in front of me. Does that help answer those questions? Sure, of course.
Oh, okay, well, I think next up on the agenda is a coffee break. So probably if you have any more questions, I'm guessing Jeff's going to be around here for the coffee break. But let's put our hands together once more and thank Jeff for his insights. And we want to give you some immediate feedback about how much we really enjoyed it. So we want to say thank you and present you with a custom-made Farming Smarter shoehorn. I'm not quite sure how you're going to get it all the way back to Dallas, but there you go. Because when you get older, those sore muscles you'll need them more. It works.